diversity of those threats. So I want you to get a good understanding of what the landscape is. And again, the federal government, looking at how we operate in the country, all emergencies are local. When the local capacity has been reached, they reach out to the state government. The state provides support to the local government. If the state capacity has been reached, the federal government comes in to support the state and locals. And so FEMA is clearly the best entity to understand this nationwide perspective on the state of our preparedness. And so those are two good documents to review to better understand, from the perspective of emergency manager, what issues and threats we face in terms of emergency management. And again, the rest of week 2 and 3 are similar to really give you a baseline of understanding risks and threats. One of the first things you'll do as emergency manager is to come into a local government and say, what are the risks and threats we face here? If you're in Florida, Miami, you got to consider hurricanes. You probably don't concern yourself as much with earthquakes, but if you still should have a plan and understand that threat. But the location of Miami, Florida, is a prime location for hurricanes based on its geography. Conversely, if you're in San Francisco, California, you understand that place is at risk for earthquakes. And so understanding that baseline of threats and risks is important. So that's going to be the focal point of weeks 1 and 3. Then we move into planning. So after you understand risks and threats, what are the core components for understanding how to plan? The federal government, again, provides us with guidance. The go-to for planning nationwide is CPG 101 and the basis of planning. Also, the textbook reading will talk about CPG 101 as well. And so we'll look at planning in depth. What does a emergency operation plan look like? What are some of the core components of that plan? And we'll discuss that in depth. You also have the FEMA course to look at that as well. Then we move into mitigation planning. Mitigation is understanding how to alleviate or lessen the potential impact of a disaster by taking steps before disaster occur. And so, I added planning to that because, once you understand how to mitigate, you got to mitigate that by implementing a plan. And so that continues to focus on planning. And then we look at planning and look at the state's emergency operation plan and continue on looking at CPG 101 in week 6. That brings us all the way up to the midterm in week 7, February 26th through March 3rd. So again, the first half of the semester is going to be focused on the basis of emergency preparedness, understanding our risks and threats, and then really honing in on the focus on planning. The second half of the semester, after the midterm, we'll talk about response. How do we respond to these disasters? Who comes to the table? Earlier, I mentioned all the public safety disciplines, fire, law enforcement, public health, nonprofit, private sector, state, federal, local. We talk about response and how we communicate and coordinate response. And this is where we really focus on the National Incident Management System, which ensures that nationally we all are following a same format for coordination and communication. This helps us when there's a big natural disaster and you have to send someone from California to Colorado. How do they plug in to support Colorado? Well, it's because they follow the same national guidance. That's the National Incident Management System. That's the National Incident Command System as well. And then I integrate a couple of videos throughout the semester, so you can see real examples, Hurricane Katrina and others of real disasters that have occurred that really highlight some of the reading. So please also review and look at the videos. Those will be a component of both the midterm and the final exam. So again, we hone in on response. Week 10, we continue with response. We look at the federal guidance related to the National Response Framework. Then in week 11, we move to recovery. So, after response, response really focus on life and safety, how to remove folks out of danger's way, how to provide life-saving medical support to folks. So, once response is done, the community that's been impacted starts recovery. So you think back to the hurricanes this past summer. Folks were flooded and stranded inside their house. You saw first responders responding to lift them off their roof and to get them to safety. Now all those communities are starting to recover. You have major infrastructure damage. You have homes that have been destroyed. You have schools destroyed. How do you, in Puerto Rico, you have the electrical grid that is down. Is part of it is still down at this point. You have Dominion and other resources coming from Virginia and other places headed over to Puerto Rico. So recovery focuses on that long process, and recovery is the longest process of the emergency management cycle. How does a local government recover from a disaster? And so we'll focus in week 11 and 12 on recovery. We'll look at some of the impediments to recovery and some of the issues related to that. Then we look at, for a week, we look at terrorism as it relates to international terrorism, ISIS and that threat. But we also look at the domestic threat of terrorism from extremist groups here in the United States. And then, final couple of weeks of the semester, want to look at some of the current challenges that you face as emergency manager. Week 14, we look at coordination challenges and budget issues. Coordination challenges, again, you got that diverse group of public safety stakeholders. Sometimes it's hard to corral them. Not sometimes, all the time it's hard to corral them. But we'll talk about how to bring all those entities together. We also talk about the budget issues facing emergency management. A lot of emergency management relies on federal grants. Unfortunately, federal grants have been cut in recent years, and the budget process has been messed up on the federal level. So, how do we sustain the capabilities that we have related to emergency management is one of the challenges. And then finally, in week 15, we talk about the future risks and threats. There's a couple of emerging issues that we face. Sea level is one of them. Extreme weather is another. We're seeing stronger, more impactful storms all across the country and the globe. How do we deal with that? I think last year, in terms of cost, we had the most damage as it relates to disasters worldwide. That's including the hurricanes, earthquakes, and etc. We have new threats related to electromagnetic pulses that threatens our electrical grid. And so how do we deal with planning for these new and emerging threats? And then also, how do we look at our human interaction and our human decisions as it relates to emergency management? A lot more people will be moving to major cities, and so that's going to put more strain and focus on how we prepare our cities. And then we finish up the semester reviewing the course, reviewing the semester's, the exam is comprehensive, so we'll do a semester review in week 16 in preparation for the final exam. So again, I know that's over 20 minutes now, but I wanted to highlight the syllabus and the reason why. Hopefully you see that each week builds on the week prior to that. Again, you have a course discussion due Wednesday at 6 p.m. today. Wednesday at 6 p.m. your introduction, and then please respond to 2 other classmates by Saturday at 6 p.m. Let me know if you have any issues with getting the book. I'll reach out to the bookstore to see if I can get a ETA on when that will come in. Again, I look forward to having a great semester with you all, and hopefully that we can learn together and help you better understand the core components of being an emergency manager. Because I think actually